Hey everybody, it's Ron with Ron's Computer Videos. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your evening and spending it here with us. We've got a great interview. Let's get right to it. He's a programmer, a gaming historian, and one of the primary contributors to the script creation utility for Maniac Mansion, Mr. Aric Wilmunder. How are you, sir?
Ron, I am doing great. I'm
Well,
also
that's good.
really, I'm looking over your shoulder there at all your Macintoshes, and it's like
Yes.
I brought out my sad little Mac here, hoping to show it off today,
I
and
love
it's
the
just
Mac Plus.
booty right now.
No, the Mac Plus is an amazing machine. It can do a lot of fun things, and especially since it can run like the really old versions of the Mac operating system. So
Exactly,
super,
exactly.
super compatible. Runs everything up to like System 755, not especially well.
I
But
was going to try to boot System 7 here just now, and I'm not sure what button I'm pressing, the wrong one, but love the machine. My only disappointment is this was not the one that was signed by all the Mac engineers and Steve Wozniak. I had it open a couple times. I had to replace one of the capacitors inside it.
oh yeah,
It kind of blew up, even though it wasn't turned on. It part of the power
yeah.
supply. You got to keep them maintained.
You do. But hey, after the interview, we'll talk. If you need any parts, I will get them sent to you. But let's just we'll get started. What got you interested in computers and programming back in the day?
I was really fortunate. I grew up in Palo Alto, which is just slightly down the hill from Stanford University, and as such, we had a lot of influence by the university, and including many parents. So my father worked at Stanford. Many of my fellow students, our parents were Stanford University professors or engineers, and in the seventh grade. They offered a computer programming class, and it turned out that the school district had ordered an HP 3000 computer, and for some reason they couldn't deliver it on time. So in the interim, they gave the school district an HP 2000, and the district used that for a while. And then when the 3000 was delivered, they didn't take the 2000 away, so they needed to do something with it, and they basically connected it to all the junior high schools. So Mr. Johnson decided he was going to try to teach a bunch of 12-year-old kids how to program computers. And it was probably the first time I almost got thrown out of a computer science class. A buddy, Alan, and I had, I was the big influence. I found an old Playboy magazine, and in the back, you know how like Mad Libs, where fill in the words, blank the blank said the blank blank. Well, I found one that was in the back of Playboy, and we decided to apply what Mr. Johnson had been teaching us about string arrays and random number generation, and it just worked beautifully. And pretty soon, the teletypes were churning out printouts of rather suggestive sentences. And Mr. Johnson pulled us aside and sort of questioned us about, what would your parents think? And I know my father would have killed me. And Alan was great. He said, "Oh, my dad thought this was great. We learned all these things. We had to debug it, and we had to figure out random numbers and sentence construction, all these things." And poor Mr. Johnson was kind of going, "Gee, I was going to chew these guys out, but they're actually applying everything I taught them this year." So we unfortunately had to delete the program, but I still have a printout of it hanging out in the garage somewhere. So
That's great.
I sort of envision it like, that story with, you take a million monkeys and put them in front of a million typewriters, and pretty soon they're writing Shakespeare. Well, here you take, 20 or 30 kids who grew up, near a university, and you put them in front of a computer, and pretty soon we were writing games, anything we could type in. My father got me the programming guide, the complete programming guide to the machine, and I had a Hayes modem, which I didn't realize they only made about 3,000 or 4,000 of these. These were the beautiful wooden boxes. You go to open the top and put in your handset, because you couldn't connect computers to the phone system because AT&T owned the phone system. So we had, Hayes developed an acoustic modem that just spoke through the tones on the phone. I think it was 110 baud. I can't even imagine what that would be in today's standards. And my dad found an old junked terminal that had died, a display terminal, and he fixed it up. And so one of my projects is I found a version of Star Trek and typed it all in, but instead of it just scrolling up on the screen, I set it up so the long range scan was always in the corner, and then the quadrant scan and your weapon systems down below. And once I had that where it was updating, it was still a play turn by turn game, but eventually I updated and added new types of torpedoes and planet busters, so you could literally fire something at a planet and or a sun and cause it to nova, and that would actually then take out all the Klingon ships around you. So unfortunately, no code left from that game. Just a lot of really good memories. And then after that, I was teaching. Sort of the troublemakers that have too much time on their hands. The teachers would get you to teach other students. I was teaching elementary kids how to get into trouble, and then before college, I started. I found a company in Palo Alto. I wrote a series of projects called CompuHome. So the owner had developed these with another engineer, and I think it was for the Commodore PET. It was a TRS-80 for the PET, and I think I was coding it for the Atari 800. So essentially trying to take advantage of the Atari 800 and what it could do graphically. So there were simple things like a checkbook balancing program and a convert your something where you could enter your gas information, but instead of just sort of boring putting in your gas mileage and such, it would start up and it would boot up and it would show a dashboard and make engine revving sounds. And the check cashing program drew a check at the beginning and signed it. And we had a visitor, I think, at the office, and he had said he was going to distribute, was interested in distributing the products on the East Coast. And a boss gave him a copy. And about 2 weeks later, we started getting phone calls. He was selling them to people. And somebody actually found I had a 1 penny off calculation in my checkbook balancing program. And it was like, so fortunately, I wasn't the one who gave him the copy. But so you learn your lessons from that. And then into games, I guess I was home from college about a month, and my mom was like, you need to do something with your life. And I looked at the back of all the computer magazines that I used to read, and I used to write articles for a couple of them. And there were 2 ads for companies. One was Microprose, I think, or SSI. I think it might have been SSI doing strategic simulators, and another one for automated simulations. And they were just 15, 20 minutes from my house, and I went by, and I think SSI said, oh yeah, we'll talk to you next week, and automated said, can you start now? So they had developed, Jim Connolly and John Freeman had developed very early adventure games. Basically, a lot of them were very similar to board games that were being brought over to the TRS-80 and the Apple II computers. Mm-hmm. And the Atari 800 was sort of an up-and-coming machine, and that was essentially where my background was. And so that summer, I finished one of the games. I think I started the second game, and before I left for college. So basically, I put myself through college writing computer games.
That's amazing.
How much more do you want to hear?
Oh, that's really, really great, though. I know that it's a lot of it is right place, right time. It feels like for a lot of people's stories where it's just like there was this amazing opportunity, or someone opened the door for me, or I happened to know somebody that I went to school with that was already working at HP, or they were working at IBM or something, and that opened a door that led to this amazing career. So it's great to hear that that it's just one of those things where it's like, I had a couple of opportunities and somebody was just like, start today, and it launches this amazing career.
No, it was perfect. I think. And West. Oh boy, I'm going to miss her last name. Okay, she and John Freeman started Free Fall. So Ann Westfall. She was one of my first bosses there, which was great. And they were terrific because while I was studying at USC down in Los Angeles, they would fly me up about once a month. And I'd bring floppy disks of all the latest work and get, printouts of all the latest code. And one of the benefits was my girlfriend was up here. So, I'd spend, part of the weekend doing updates and then having date night afterwards.
Well, that's nice.
Yeah.
You get to come home. But so this was kind of one of your earliest like paid programming gigs. When did you join Atari Corporate Research?
I've been, well, let me go back to USC briefly, because my dad was an electrical engineer for Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
And, he kind of thought, oh, well, my son's going to follow in my footsteps because that's what he loved. And my sandbox was software development. But when I went off to USC, he signed me up for electrical engineering. So I spent a semester doing all the EE classes, and the only one that I liked at all was Fortran, because it was programming, and Fortran is a horrible, miserable language. And so the next semester, I just said, the heck with that. And I just went through the CS catalog, and I just said, oh, that looks good, and that looks good, and I'll try a little of that. Ooh, that hey, I've got a computer that can sort of do that. Why don't I, take a class in that? And so I did. And I came back the following year and figured I should change majors. And the guidance counselor came in, and she, I introduced myself, and she said, oh, let me go get your transcript. And she went, and she was away for probably 10 minutes and came back and said, oh, there's something completely wrong here. And then she went away again, and then she came back and she says, I can't make heads or tails of your transcript. You're an EE student, and you just took CS 105, 110, 205, 210, and it was either 410 or 450, which was like, grad level, course. And I said, yep, I took all of those. And she said, you can't do that. You have to take this before you take that. I said, but I got A's in all those classes. It's like, yeah, but you can't do it that way. And she says, in 450, what are you doing there? I said, well, there were 30 kids in the class. There were 5 A's. I was one of the 5 A's. What's the issue? She says, you just can't do it that way. So that kind of taught me, education, it's important, but for myself, it was sort of blocking me. I grew up in Silicon Valley. I used to attend Homebrew computer club meetings. One of my neighbors, Doug Engelbart, invented the computer mouse. So yes. I just sort of grew up watching Star Trek and Mr. Spock and computers and going, hey, everybody does this stuff. And I remember sitting in some presentation at USC, and they were telling me, it's like, yeah, with a programming career, you could be making $25,000 a year as a programmer. And I kind of looked back and I said, I'm doing this on the side and I'm making almost twice that. What am I doing here? Why am I here?
Yeah.
So I pulled the ripcord on college after my junior year, and I had 2 job offers, and one was to go work at NASA, and one was to go work at Atari Corporate Research. And I've always had a soft spot in my heart for NASA. I've been, to multiple rocket launches. I was a congressional guest for STS-135, which was the final shuttle launch. I was, greeted by astronauts and just had a wonderful time there. But computers were really where my heart is. And the nice thing about it now being retired is I can sit there and follow the space program pretty closely and enjoy it while I'm busy doing other projects. So got a job offer, and you mentioned sort of always being fortunate or being at the right place at the right time. And there's a certain amount of that, but I've also never had a fear of walking up to somebody and introducing myself and what I'm up to and what I know about them and what I'm interested in doing, and that applies all the time. So it's not just purely luck. It's sort of making your opportunities, or paying close attention. And when you see something that interests you, my rule has pretty much always been find something you love to do, and then find somebody who's willing to pay you to do it. So that's basically been my professional career is doing what I love to do. So I ended up at Atari Corporate Research and working in a team under Dr. Alan Kay. And Dr. Alan Kay, his I think it was his college thesis was called oh goodness, now I'm not going to remember. It wasn't laptop, it was something book. It was not something like Uber book or something like that. I'll think of it in about 3 seconds. And essentially it was the notion of, instead of a laptop, you'd have this device, and instead of a mouse, it had track like a trackball underneath it. So you'd have a physical desk and you'd move it over to one corner, and it's like, oh, there's my word processor, and you'd move it over here, and there's my email and my notes. And Dynabook, like I said, about 3 seconds. So that was his Dynabook project. And I was working in a team that was basically doing experimental games under Chris Crawford. And Chris had developed one of the very early Atari games that I think was released through the Atari Program Exchange. So there was a group that was built inside Atari. When people wrote games and products, they could submit them to Atari instead of one of the internally developed products. And Chris, I think because he wrote it on his own time, was able to submit it as a independently developed project. And he wrote a program called SCRAM, which was about managing a nuclear reactor. And so he had done that project, and then he'd also written another game called Eastern Front, which was essentially based on some of the other very early board games on the German and the Russian front, I believe it was, during World War II. And he had a concept for a game called Gossip, and he'd written it in Atari Basic using floating point math. And his model was up to 8 players, one being the human player. And the model was 8 points in space. I've got 10 fingers, but pretend this is just 8. And between each point is a spring, which is either pulling a point closer to another point or pushing them apart. And these were supposed to represent relationships. And the pulling together was, you felt closer to an individual or convinced them for them to feel closer to you. And then pushing apart was if you didn't like somebody, you could distance yourself from them. And the goal of this was pretty, I'm going to say, it's kind of cruel, but I'm going to use the word, it's simplistic, that it was, you're trying to become the most popular person in the group. And, but the physical model was kind of fascinating, but the Atari math was very, very slow. And I think it took 8 or more hours per turn. And so it wasn't really a playable game unless you were fond of like playing chess by mail, where you'd write down your move and you'd mail it to somebody and wait 3 days for the letter to come back. So he wanted something that could be played where each move could be done in, say, less than 30 seconds. So Atari Basic wasn't going to work, and Floating Point wasn't going to work. So I rewrote all that code in, I think, 16-bit math, and it was pretty hairy mathematics that was going in to do the math. And I did a whole bunch of testing. I took his math system and I ran the math, and I took my math system and I ran the math, and I got the same results. But ultimately, the game experience just wasn't really compelling. And I put a wrapper around it with cute kids on telephones, and they sort of talked like the parents on Charlie Brown. So they kind of went wah 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 wah, yeah wah 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 wah, and you'd talk back and forth to the kids. And Chris just wasn't. When he played it, it was a very different experience, because when you played it where you had 8 hours between turns, you're running all these scenarios through your head, trying to figure out what's going on. When it got turned into a very fast turn-by-turn game, that model sort of fell apart. And he thought it might have been an issue with the mathematics. I think later he hired a woman whose background was in optics, Kim Whitmore. And actually, she, I think, went through all the math and ran the same tests I did and said, nope, the math is just fine. But, it was a very useful project, and I sort of felt I'd put my time in there. And so after a year, I tendered my resignation. My then girlfriend, now wife, who I'd come up to the Bay Area to visit, she'd gotten her undergraduate degree, and I took her to Europe for 6 weeks. And so that was, in the middle of the trip planning, I got a message from Atari Coin-Op saying, hey, while you were busy working on that other game, you kept doing these 3D spaceships and rotating planets and star fields moving by. How would you like to do a game with us, based on that? How would you like to do the sequel to Star Raiders?
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, oh, that's what I don't, I would love doing that. That was, one of the things I'd love to do. And so I said, sure. And then just before I left for Europe, they told me that they had brought on another engineer who was going to get started on it before I got back. And that made my heart sink. It's like, what are they going to do? And so sure enough, I came back and there was some code that had been written trying to do the galactic chart, but it wasn't based at all on the systems and the technology that I've been developing and didn't fit really well in. So I had a really good talk with that engineer, and he was a phenomenal engineer. And he actually went on to work on an experimental project. I don't remember if we ever shipped it, but it was using 3D solid polygonal drawing version of Last Starfighter. So the opening screen running on, and I can't remember what system it was, but looked almost exactly like the video game that was in the movie. And so he went off that direction. It was like, okay, now I've got, here we go, end to end. So worked on that for close to a year, and what I noticed it was like coming in every day was like working in a minefield where Atari was sort of having financial difficulties, and you'd come in one day and there'd be a bunch of people in the hallway going, Charlie's gone. Did you know Charlie? Charlie's gone. And then the next week later, somebody else would be gone. And I just took the mindset of, keep my nose down, get my work done. I can't change what's going on the corporate side. So I just continued working on my project, and which was the sequel to Star Raiders 2. And then some devastating news came in. They had a team inside, I think, the home computer division. They had licensed Last Starfighter, and it actually had a team of, I think, 4 engineers, spent a year or more trying to develop a game based on the Starfighter franchise. And when it didn't do as well as I think they were hoping in the theater, Atari decided, why would we pay a license for something that didn't have a really good license? Well, what can we do with it? They said, well, we could do Star Raiders 2 with it. So here I had been developing something that was truly based on the original Star Raiders franchise, and a marketing team had made a decision to we'll just sort of rebrand this other product. Yeah. And they did some lovely work, but it wasn't at all, truly a sequel. So back, I don't know, when was it? 2005, 2015. No, I think it was 2005. I'd been interviewed and somebody said, oh, so we heard you worked on Star Raiders 2. And I said, yeah, that was 85, so almost 30 years ago. I said, well, why don't I go get out that code and we can talk about it afterwards. And I decided to release the code. And it's kind of funny getting really good reviews for a game that was never completely finished back in '84, but people saying, oh man, where's this been hiding all these years? And part of it was, copyrights and everything else, but Atari's gone through so many people's hands. I figured that nobody would be worrying too much about what I was up to. No. But eventually, the situation at Atari did catch up with me, and got a layoff notice. And what I had did for about 2 months was I was hoping to finish the game. So I'd approached the Tramiel brothers who had bought the Atari rights, and I said, hey, I'm almost done with this. Would you approve if I continue working on it? We'll figure out some deal on paperwork. And it was like, oh, sure, keep working on it. And then I'd come back a month later and it's like, oh yeah, keep working on it. Yeah, we'll get around to some paperwork. And I understood they had their own priorities. But about the 2.5 months in, I realized I'm working on something. I've got no contract. I have to move on. And about that time, I got a phone call, I think, from the Lucas organization, and they'd also seen my work. They'd actually, because Atari had put up a significant amount of funding for the Lucas Games organization at the beginning, and that was used for buying hardware and other stuff. I was aware of their work. They were sort of aware of my work, and they said, "Hey, we understand you've been working on some 3D spaceships and things like that. Could you show us what you're doing?" I said, "Hey, not a problem. Hey, for me, a chance to go up and maybe, walk down the same hallways as George Lucas," and showed him the work, and, very relaxed, and a, lovely afternoon. And about a week later, got a phone call asking if I'd be interested in coming up there to work. And I said, "Oh, well, when would you like me to come in and interview?" And they said, "Oh, no, we already interviewed you last week. When would you like to start?" It's like, well, if I'd known they were interviewing me, I probably would have been a little bit more than nervous. But as it turned out, they had a project, Koronis Rift, that Noah Falstein was designing, and it was 3D terrain based on the same fractal engine that was used in Koronis Rift and the Eidolon.
Rescue on Fractalus, and
exactly. But instead of a flying model, it was a driving model. So instead of flying through the hills, basically you're in a souped up ground vehicle collecting remnants of alien. I think even one of the original designs, it was referred to as alien technology, as gathering up bits of spaceships from other spaceships and ground vehicles, and then you had a robot on board, sort of your R2, who would take them apart. And I don't know if you sold them. I forget what the dynamics were at that point, but then you could buy them to upgrade your technology, etc. And that's where Ron Gilbert and I first started working together. So Ron was the Commodore 64 engineer. I was the Atari 800 engineer, and Ron and I shared an office together for, I don't remember how many years, but it was all the way from there and a couple moves, and eventually we shared an office together at Skywalker Ranch while he was starting Maniac Mansion, and I think I was working on Habitat at the time. So we would be there, and we'd work until 2 a.m, and a lot of it was since both machines had 6502 processors inside them. We spent a lot of time sort of engineering and figuring out how to not both be writing the same code. So even though, for example, the flying saucers on the Atari were done in a bitmap mode, I think they were done in sprites on the Commodore 64. So since I was doing the scaling and the drawing algorithm, I just figured out a way that they could draw, to either surface graphically. So we'd have really exactly the same gameplay on both machines. And then in terms of things like performance, we would do that. And then we also had tools that, as the Commodore 64 sort of began to take more, I'm going to use this the right word, preeminence over the Atari 800, Ron and I would go through and we'd convert tools. So we had the animation tool that had originally been developed. I think it was called ACE, so the Atari cell editor that was used in products like Labyrinth. But when we wanted to use them for the Commodore for the projects like Maniac Mansion and Zack, Ron and I think in one weekend figured out a way to get that code. We sort of, if we stay up the whole weekend, can we get this done by Monday kind of weekend? And sure enough, we didn't have all the bugs out, but one Monday morning came around and people were showing up at the office. We needed a shower, but the code was effectively up and running. And then I think we renamed it to Case at the time. So it was the Commodore cell editor, and that eventually turned into, and while that was used, I think, for the original Maniac and Zack, as we began to develop the PC engines, that became, I think, originally BILE, BYLE, which, so along with our wondrous terms where we had SCUMM was the compiler and Sputum was the engine that ran on the different devices that we shipped. We had BILE, which was the animation editor, a newer version of that was written called CYST. We had FLEM, which was used for editing the rooms and the walk boxes and the objects. So inside FLEM, you could say, open and close the door. You could make the clock, tick through the different states. Later versions let you do Z-planes, so you could, render different Z-planes so the actors would appear to walk behind tables. Later versions of that the animation system became CYST, CYST, and USWEAT and USMELL, which was a poke of fun at iMUSE. So Michael Land and the sound team, which we have the ultimate respect for, I think they either got a patent or a trademark on the sound system. What it did, if you look at Maniac, I think especially, not Maniac, Monkey Island, especially two, I think, like in the town where you're walking through the town and you walk into each room and the music theme is continuing to flow in as you go into the room, and then the theme changes and hooks up, and then you leave the room and it goes back to the theme for the town. Just amazing stuff. But I think they got either a trademark or a patent or something on iMUSE, and so we just kind of said, oh, okay, so we had two different tools and we needed names for them. So we called them USWEAT and USMELL. And I don't know if Michael ever picked up that we were sort of poking fun at the sound guys, but we were all pretty, pretty even keeled. I don't think I ever saw much more than a light argument amongst any of us. We were all there enjoying what we were doing so much. So where have I left off? I've covered a lot of ground. Where would you like to go from here?
Well, I was just we were talking about your early career, so it's an excellent kind of recap of that. But you got us up to joining LucasArts and being part of the SCUMM team and all of that. But I think something that's really interesting is kind of like before the adventure game era started. All the collaboration and everything that went into kind of these action titles, the kind of more of an arcade kind of gameplay. And then you brought up Labyrinth for just a second, which is kind of one of those like pivotal kind of titles for early Lucasfilm games, because that feeds into something which is the world's first MMO, which is Habitat.
Yeah.
So that's and I don't think Habitat got a fair shake back in the day. It's unfortunate that it kind of had that short lifespan because there was nothing else like it.
It was an amazing project and a really remarkable team. And one of the funny things is it credit. You talk about being in the right place at the right time. Credit is an incredibly nebulous item, who did something, etc. And it was always kind of funny because, I worked on Habitat and I'll get back to that. But Chip, Morningstar, and Randy really kept pushing the idea. So they kept pushing Habitat. And I think Habitat might have been sold to Fujitsu and they kept developing in that area. And so there were a couple of us that had been on the project when we were doing the Commodore 64, and we sort of ended up disappearing into the mist behind it. And I talked to Chip and Randy because like the Wikipedia page, made no mentions of the rest of the team and their contributions. And they were like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Now, the flip side of it is SCUMM, where I probably get more credit in some regards than I deserve because Chip actually created the original language. Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating there is Chip is one of the most amazing engineers, and the SCUMM compiler is tokenized. And what that means is there's a language, like you have a command like say line Dr. Fred and your little dog too, whatever it is. And that say line is a command. And so there's a token, which is a byte value, and a byte is a number from 0 to 255. And so let's say command 47 is a say line command. And then the next byte after that is who the person is. So the next byte is Dr. Fred, and somewhere in a table it says Dr. Fred is actor number 13. So we have a 47 and a 13, and then a string. So the tokens that the interpreter, that the game is playing, is all just numbers. And one of the benefits to that is that you just have to write a command that says, oh, when a 47 comes in, get the next value, that's the person. Now get the string that follows and put it up at the top of the screen, and then animate the characters so their mouth moves while they're talking. And then we had an algorithm where you take the length of what they were saying and you did some math on it, and you start a counter so it knew how long to leave that text up on the screen. So a short message would only take a few seconds, and a longer message would take more. And that's one of the reasons that SCUMM development was very, much easier to do than other projects, because since there were only about 120 or 130 commands in the language, out of that 255, it means half the numbers that are out there are invalid commands. And so when you're going and pulling a command and saying, what's my command? And 47, okay, I know how to do that. And if the next command you pull is 212, well, there is no command 212. It means something is corrupted in memory. And the nice thing you do is you just halt the system and say, something broke. I don't know what it is. This is not a valid command, but don't go any further. And your odds were 50-50 that a command was going to be, above 127, that your command was going to be invalid if you were just running random memory. So finding and fixing bugs was really easy in SCUMM. Habitat was exactly the opposite. It was written in 6502 assembly language, which is the native executable code. So it uses byte commands as well, but it has, a couple hundred different commands, and they all do completely different things. And some of them are very disruptive, like fill memory with garbage, or, start a register this, or, it is just random commands and nothing that would ever stop it. And worse than that, it was basically using a very similar version of the memory manager as the SCUMM system, because we had to be able to load in actors and backgrounds and sound effects and music and rooms, and all these things were loaded in what programming parlance is called a heap. Yeah, these engineers, they're a bunch of funny guys. And in the heap, what you do is, you would put a timestamp on it saying, oh, the last time I used this sound effect was, 300 seconds ago, and I need more room. All right, go through and you look at everything and you say, what's old? And you throw out everything, you throw out things that are old until you have enough room to fit the new thing in. Well, when you throw out the old things, it leaves memory completely fragmented into all these pieces. And so one of the things you do is a heap compact, where you take and you push everything down to one end and update all the things that point to them saying where they are. And now you've made enough room over here to put something else in there. So the memory manager was about the same, but when you're moving things around, if there's a bug and your code is executing things that might be moving around or might have moved and you made a mistake, it blows up really ugly, and half the time it destroys the machine. You have to reboot it. So debugging it is very difficult. And so I think that the other aspect of it is that Chip wanted to make sure that the computers themselves couldn't be hacked by developers, and false commands were being put in that acted differently. So a lot of the time, the same code was being run on the Commodore 64 was also being run on, I think it was a Stratus mainframe. And so Chip, this code was being written for the Commodore 64, similar code was being written for the Stratus, and I'm putting people to sleep right now. But
no,
if
this is the perfect audience for this. We are all about deep dive.
If we had tokenized Habitat, I think it would have been a lot more robust. And so the challenge for me was, my task was the graphical engine. So, I'd already worked with, Charlie Kellner had developed parts of the Fractal engine, and had developed the animation system that was used for the Labyrinth game, and also for the Eidolon. So very simple animation, cell-based. It was essentially modeled after what traditional animators would do, where you could, let's say, actually, I'll tell you a funny story. I was just telling somebody as a kid, when I was about 4 or 5, we were going to go to Disney we were going to go down to LA, and I had visions of Disneyland, and that was great. No, it actually turned out my dad knew, I think it was Ollie Johnson, who was one of the original 7 animators at Disneyland.
7 old men. Yep.
Exactly. And I think Ollie had trains, and my dad, we had a little train set that ran around the backyard. And by little, it was about 1 foot gauge. So you sat on it and you rode on it. Walt had a little train, but his was like a steam locomotive. Ours, had a car battery that ran it. And so my dad knew Ollie. And so we weren't going to Disneyland. We were going down to Disney Studios, which probably was even more amazing nowadays when I look at it, because Ollie did, among other things, and I'm sure I've got Ollie's name right. Ollie did, I think, the dancing penguins for Mary Poppins.
Mary Poppins, yeah.
And he was working on the Jungle Book. So I have a very strong memory from when I was 4 or 5 years old of Mowgli walking along, with this machine with 2 cranks to go forward or backwards, and a roll of film and a little tiny screen that was probably 6 inches across. And here's Mowgli walking along with Baloo the bear, and it might have been with Bagheera or one of the other characters. And I had no idea what I was seeing, and I had no idea. I just wanted to go to Disneyland.
Yeah.
And this wasn't it, but it was still, just an amazing experience. So the animation system that we were developing was in some ways related to what they were doing, which is you might build the torso of a character separate from the facial expressions. And so you'd you'd call it cell animation, because you'd have this celluloid, this piece of clear plastic that animators would draw pictures on, and then other animators would come in with paint and fill in the pictures, and you'd lay that one on top of another piece, on top of another piece, and on top of a background, and you put all these pieces together, and that's what made cartoon animation and all the Disney movies that we saw up through the 80s, before computer technology took over.
Yeah.
So our system allowed us to put layers on top of layers. So in Habitat, one of my tasks was developing the avatar. Now, the original document was 1 male, 1 female. That's all we thought we had the memory for. And monocolor, so they're in the graphics mode that had been selected to use. We had 3 colors. We had black, pink, blue. No, actually, the background's going to have more colors, but we only had 4 colors that we could draw the characters in. Anyway, so there were only 3 colors and transparent that we could use. So black, pink, and blue and transparent. Those were the 4 colors for drawing the different avatars in. And so I got that system up and running. And what it meant was we had a torso and we had legs. So the torso didn't change, but you could have the legs walking with the torsos, and then the arms were separate, so the arms could swing back and forth. And then the head was separate, and then the face was separate, so that you could, the head was separate with the face drawn on top of it, so you could have different expressions. And got that running, and it's like, we can do better than this. So I started first, I think I played around with height, because we had the legs separated from the torso. So what happens if we lower the torso down? Basically, it created shorter characters, and we could create taller characters. And then it was, then I began playing around with the colors. And instead of a solid color, I developed a system where you could pattern them. So instead of just solid blue, you could instead, wherever blue was, you could draw a pattern, fill it in with a pattern. So you could have checkers or houndstooth, or solid black or solid pink or solid, So suddenly all these colors changed. Then I was adding the graphical system for holding and carrying objects. So you could bend over and pick up a box, or you could carry a magic wand. And the magic wand, a limb not only moved, but it had a target location for when something would be connected to it. Where would that thing be displayed? So I could just sort of pre-calculate where, if the hand was holding, say, a gun, where would the gun be in relationship to the hand, and draw them in the proper orders. So we had that. And then one night I thought about it, and it's like, we had a male head and we had a female head. What if I made them just like objects that you pick up? And so since you can pick up a gun and carry it, what if you could pick up a head and put the head on. So the artist had experimented with a bunch of different head concepts while developing the original avatar shapes. And so I switched the system around that, I created objects that instead of just being objects were heads. And instead of just picking them up, when you did pick them up, they would replace, the head that you had on, and your current head would go into your inventory. And suddenly now we had a whole byte, I think, devoted to what head you were wearing. And the artist just went crazy, lizards and frogs and
Mhm.
spiders and ants and things like that. And I'd actually taken it to the next level, which was, well, if you can do that and completely modify your avatar, well, we had other characters. I think Ron was working on Maniac Mansion while I was working on Habitat. So I said, hey, can I go borrow, one of your tentacles?
Mhm.
And so I took the whole tentacle and the tentacle animation system from Maniac Mansion, and soon we had a tentacle jumping around inside the game. And I remember it might have been somewhere around this time, Kurt Russell was in the remake of The Thing. And in
Mhm.
it, there's, the aliens have come to Earth and they're nasty and they can take over people's bodies. And there's one scene where there's like a spider, or I think there's a head, and it
Mhm.
grows spider legs, and then
Yes.
the head goes running off the screen. I thought,
Norris head, I think is what
yeah,
that's called.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's like I can draw. I'm not a great animator. I can draw a spider. It's 16 straight lines or whatever. It's just take the legs, put one joint in them. I can do that. So I developed a spider that then had the attributes of a human being, which meant when you picked up a head, the head would go on the spider, and the spider could go running around as well. So I developed all the avatar code and also basically the rendering side. So all of the background rooms and the code to develop the rooms, and then developed all the rooms themselves. So we had some basic ideas of what the world should look like, and so the vast majority of the world was my space. And then at one point, I began working on a project. I think it was codenamed Reno, which is the region editor. I forget what the NO was for, but it was the idea was the real power is letting other people create the world itself. Because my vision was that a really powerful construct in Habitat would be the turnstile. And that's something you put money in and you can go inside, and you can, the owner of the turnstile can decide how much to charge. So we could give somebody their house and like a little backyard, space off the side, and let them go build the world, but then give them a turnstile, because then you can create an economy where if you can make an interesting space, people will go through the turnstile, go into your space, and let the users build the world. Because uh, I am not the only person, that can do this creatively. And like I said, my artistic background, I sort of look at artists and engineers, because I've got twins, and I sort of at the time thought, at what point do artists and engineers split? And we would cut up bananas, and they one would like take and they'd mush the bananas down and they'd smear them all over, and the other one would stack them up, like they're making a building. And it's like, okay, artists and engineers, their brains do work differently. So we got partway through that. We never got to the point of letting people actually design their own avatars. And that was sort of the next level. And speaking of sort of next levels, seeing Ready Player One was kind of like, okay, yeah. And actually, and there's a funny story behind that. About a year after Habitat, ILM called me up and they said, hey, we need you to come join us at a meeting. And what it was somebody was working on licensing Snow Crash, and Snow Crash is all about the digital universes and avatars and things like that. And so
Mhm.
since I sort of had my foot in that area, they said, okay, what can you tell us about avatars? And I said, when it's really done, anything that is you're going to people always want attention. They want to draw attention. So many people want to draw attention to themselves. You cannot go too far, because people, given the opportunity and the tools and the economy where you can hire somebody to go design an avatar for you, yes, you're going to see every character, every Disney character, Hello Kitty, and everything else, and then it's going to get really crazy. So I said, do not feel like there's any line you cannot cross, in terms of, conceptually. And sadly, I think they marketed that for a little bit, and I think the studios just may have realized that it was going to be too expensive to do that until years later, where with something like Ready Player One, and I can imagine the people just getting the licenses for all those characters probably spent months, if not years, getting
Yeah.
those lined up.
Mm-hmm. I can't
So
imagine it's putting something like that together for like an online experience, because I mean, it's easy now because like Disney just owns everything, so it's been one of those things where it's just sort of like oh, finally Dr. Frankenfurter is now like owned by Disney, so we can stick him in
yeah,
whatever we want, or
yeah,
it's all these things that used to be really tough, where it was you still have Warner on one side, and you kind of have Disney on the other. With Who Framed Roger Rabbit would be like a great example of something contemporary, where it was just like, well, I say contemporary, that movie's like 30 years
30
old.
years old now. But they did
Yeah.
collaborate. There actually, there are Warner characters, there are Disney characters in there,
Hmm. Yeah.
and I think the studio saw the benefit of keeping these characters and getting them out on a big screen, but that was a huge risk.
Yeah.
Nobody had done anything like it before,
Hmm.
and there were other products. What am I thinking of? Oh, there was George did, not Rabbit. He did Howard the Duck.
Yes.
And so
Hmm.
doing cartoon tie-ins, if how I don't remember the order of release, but Howard could have killed them all if they looked at that and said, okay, what do taking a license and go with it. But we also had almost a decade of, you go to the movie theaters and you get down to the last 15 minutes of the movie, and it was basically going to turn into, what is ILM going to do at the end of this movie, and what characters are going to pop up, or be evil, and generally it was spectacular. But after 10 years of it, it faded a bit. But then at that time, what's occurred over time is really, and this ties into what our charter was within the Lucas organization, which was, to George's credit, what he saw was computers and movies were going to become more and more integrated. And he'd seen the beginning of it, where using computers to control models to move spaceships around. And then over time, then ILM began experimenting with creating single frames, photorealistic images, things that you can go onto ChatGPT and do 10 times better these days. There are very early images where somebody, a team built an X-Wing fighter. There's another very early
Hmm.
piece called Point Rays, which was simply an ocean view with a chain link fence along the side and a mountain in the distance, and that was all CG generated. So George, to his credit, really had a sense that these technologies are all going to merge into something new and different. And so our charter was try to figure out what that is. Figure out, how do we tell stories and use computers to tell stories. So that's where I think Rescue, with with the when the aliens would jump up and crack your windshield, was one of the first really cinematic scenes where people would jump. And then what you saw, what we did with with Full Throttle later on, where
Yeah.
that game would boot up and people would hear the music and then walk down the hallway to be in your office just to listen to it, and then watch the visual effects in it. And then what you see is, with movies like the Avengers, where I don't know what the count is, but it used to be you might have a couple hundred special effects shots in an entire movie, and now these days it's how many hours or how many minutes of
Yeah.
special effects footage do you have in the movie.
Absolutely. It's so much has changed, but I really feel that Habitat is just kind of one of those things that was just maybe ahead of its time, and didn't really get a fair shake. But so much amazing technology came out of it, that you can see, especially with games like Labyrinth, where like I mean, there it's like looking at a mirror of, you know, in terms of like art style and things like that. And so we kind of exit that arcade era, and you were getting more into like storytelling and using these tools, because I mean, you know, Lucasfilm, first of all, is kind of a storytelling organization. So you kind of graduate into having the tools with like with SCUMM and with all of the additional things that you kind of need for like your props and your actors and sound and all of those things. That it's just this amazing kind of story of how this all comes together from all these different groups and these different people with ideas. I know that you were again, you kind of undercut yourself earlier where you were like, you know, oh, I get too much credit for SCUMM and stuff. I don't know that that's true. Everybody I talk to, they talk about the enhancements, they talk about the contributions that you made to the kind of the code base on SCUMM. And I know that it kind of starts as with Ron with the like the I can't remember the name of it, but it was a basically kind of interpreter. And,
right.
it was
Human Engineering Software. I think he wrote Graphic Basic, I think, which was
that's it.
There was a basic language card, I think, made for the Commodore 64. And that's where Ron learned interpreters, because BASIC generally was an interpreted language with the byte commands. And Ron wrote some enhancements that you could load on top of it so that users programming in BASIC could do more interesting things like control sprites or you know, do more complex graphic things. So Ron already had that background, and so when he did set out to do Maniac, he knew what he wanted, as he'd already worked in a language and was already familiar with tokenizing a language. It's like, yep, I want something, and that way you clearly define what the language is. And it's what's referred to as a higher level language, because you've got assembly, which is these byte codes that you're working at the lowest level of the computer, and you want something that is more human-like and more human readable and literally script-like, where you want something that you can read the script in any of the games and kind of go, oh, that's what they're saying to do. And sure, there are going to be some esoteric ones like color control or management, things like that, but ultimately, it really comes down to, building, controlling, and telling characters. The majority and why it's a language about characters is that's what you need to do. That's where what's going to be interesting about stories are going to be involving characters. So the vast majority of the commands are manipulating individuals in it. I suggest that the majority, a large, significant number are, because there's still going to be things like mathematical, needs to be able to do math and color manipulations and starting sound effects and things like that. And then the other aspect of it is it's a multitasking language. So we could have as many as 16 different scripts running at the same time. So you could have one script just managing Dr. Fred and another one managing the clock. And the clock might simply be nothing more than move the like a cat with a tail that swings back and forth. So you just do, we got one animation like this, trigger a sound effect that says tick, wait a second, or sleep for a second. And so that was the thing, is that was the way to say this script goes away for a period of time. And then you go, okay, you wake up in a second, now animate in the second spot, play the talk sound, sleep for a second, end of script. And so that script just sits there and, you start it up. And as soon as you walk in the room, that script is running and it will run forever, just like that. And that's ideal. It's in some respects, object-oriented programming was all the notion about creating a single object, and all of its code and everything else is based on that object. And then you could take that object and say, well, I'm going to use this, and now in a bigger object or a different object, I can take attributes or characteristics from that object and use them in some other place. And so, but you still have the core of the first object wherever it goes. And so having SCUMM, it wasn't purely an object-oriented language, and people will probably argue with me, but it had some of those capabilities that allowed you to write in the language areas that simply worked on these individual items in a way without having to interact with others in a significant way.
Well, I mean, if you compare Labyrinth and Zach McCracken or Maniac Mansion, it's just night and day.
Yeah.
You know, it's just with the additional tools and the complexity and what it allowed you to do with gameplay. Because you were talking about the ticking clock. I mean, Maniac Mansion, there's literally a ticking clock from the second you gain control. You know, there are certain timed events that are absolutely going to happen every time, and you have to adjust your gameplay around those timed events. So
Right.
if you didn't have like a sort of a multi-threaded or like a game engine that could kind of like track and do all those things, I think it would have been a more linear kind of experience. Like it's just sort of like you just at your own speed, whatever. Maniac Mansion will punish you if you don't pump the gas. You've got to accomplish certain things in a certain amount of time, or otherwise you miss the window, and that's it. And
well, it's not. I'm going to argue with you there because it's never that's it. You may have to go back and restart it, and we never, ever, I think, really forced people into a reload of gameplay. And
well,
of like Sierra games was there were many Sierra games where you had to play them and fail in order to learn how not to fail. Now we might put you back at the beginning, but we'd never punish you and say, oh, basically forcing somebody to be meta playing, which is, gosh, I hope I saved my game because otherwise the last hour that I was playing is going to be lost and I'm going to be put in some state where I can't get back to it. Or even worse, you go all the way through a cave and then find out that the item that you needed, you had never picked up.
Yeah.
And
this one pixel item an hour ago in gameplay, you had to have that or otherwise you can't advance. Yes.
Right. Yeah, we took let's just say we took a slightly different philosophical approach to game and storytelling. And the other thing that we always did is very often what you'll find is our design. I'm trying to think of a good comparison. I won't come up with a perfect one, but if you think about Los Angeles, in a clover leaf on a freeway where you're trying to go different ways, but then you've got these little loops off to the side. And very often if you got stumped with one puzzle, in our games, it's like, not a problem. Go to the other end of the island. There's another, there are another series of puzzles for you to go solve. So you're not, you may be blocked in one aspect, but there are very few occasions where you're totally blocked in all aspects. And those are ones where it's like, yeah, you do need to figure that out. Just keep wandering until you find, and most of the time, I think we had very few single pixel items that you ever had to go.
There was nothing like that, but there are Maniac Mansion and Zach McCracken do kind of have a place. That there are a few dead man walking kind of scenarios, but they're not unfair. They're not unfair. If you did something to get into that, you earned it. It's not because of a gameplay mechanic or something.
Well, let's give a specific example. Go steal Weird Ed's hamster.
Yes.
Put it in the microwave. I think he says white meat or dark. I think that was my suggestion. And then I think you take that and you give it to Weird Ed.
Yes.
Look, I just took your pet and microwaved it, and now I'm giving you your pet back. I think that is more than, than an accidental, oops, I died. I think there's also, there's something where you can blow up the reactor in the house.
You can empty you can empty the pool and then don't fill it back up. And I think you have 5 minutes or something.
Right. And the same thing with Guybrush when he goes into the water in Monkey Island outside the scum bar and behind the scum bar. And he can hold his breath for 10 minutes. I think 10 minutes is long enough for you to try to figure out that you actually pick up the item and you're, exactly. So Yeah.
Again, if you did something to get in the dead man walking situation, it was something you did. You earned it, and it's never feels punitive. It always was something funny, or it was like oh well, yeah, of course I died. I did that thing. So it's so yeah, I get it. There are, I will say, Maniac Mansion, though, there are, you could play it on hard mode. You can pick certain characters, because there are a few people that just have like one specific talent.
And
So
it's pretty amazing. That's one of the things that I think Maniac has. It's always kind of, it's been a very pleasant surprise for me, is that people get very tied to specific characters. Michael F. Stock,
yeah,
and they might create this whole, I'm going to use the term fantasy, but that, oh, he's the only person who can do this and this and that. No,
yes,
he can develop the film. I don't know if there's much else that he does different than anybody else, but otherwise, they're mostly, most of the things that they do are generic. But there's going to be one puzzle that there's no way to solve it, and I think there's even some hinting around where if you play it at one point, there's a dark room.
yes,
and then you go look at Michael and you go, oh, Michael's a photographer. Well, duh. It's like, it's not a far stretch to put, what do you do with the dark? Which room should I pick next time if I want to solve in the dark room? And I think at the same time, in terms of, one of the reasons Maniac, even, sort of like Venus in the Half Shell, coming out so perfect, Maniac really had some remarkable aspects to it, with the replayability that you can go back in, and by selecting different kids at the beginning, you can solve different puzzles, and you can get different endings. You can get the Meteor Memoirs, because by rewriting
Wendy,
the Meteor, by Wendy the writer, it's like, what's Wendy the writer going to do? Oh gosh, whole new.
She's going to get him a book deal.
Exactly.
She's going to get him a book deal. That's what she's going to do.
Yep.
Now, I will say, no offense, sorry, Jeff, but you are the most useless character in this game, because the only thing you can do is fix the phone, and Bernard can fix the phone, but he can also do a bunch of other things. So he's a hard mode character to play. I would also say that, like, probably but Bernard can't use the exercise equipment, and it's just everybody's got their ups and downs. But I have probably, I will tell you, I have 10,000 hours in this game. That is not a joke. Between the PC version, between playing it on more modern machines, playing it on the original Nintendo, I'm one of those people that the second I saw it come out for the Nintendo, I went and bought that version, because I will say it's got great music. There's a lot of like quality of life stuff that's kind of built into that version. It's really great. So, not that you need to hear it, you hear it all the time, but it's
one of the things that I'll tell you that's funny about the cover. So Razor was Gary Winnick's girlfriend.
Oh, really?
And, Ron used to always wear that Lucasfilm shirt. Ron had a yellow tie like this. And so I kind of look at that cast and go, there's a little bit of Ron in each of them. In some ways, it's like, your games at some point do take on the personality of the developer.
Well, sure.
So there is a little bit of a geek in there, and maybe there's part of Ron that wishes he was hanging out, on a surfboard. I don't know, but just.
I will say though, Dave is the best character for pushing that brick in the basement. He's the best. You just get him caught, get him down there. He's letting everybody else out.
There you go.
And it's Bernard and Razor all the way, and you can just get everything else accomplished in that game.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Wendy the writer. I'm actually working on a book right now.
Oh yeah.
And so it's something I've never done before. I've written for magazines. I've written and edited newsletters, and I've got a piece coming out in of all things, a needleworking magazine. My wife and I I was looking for a present for my wife, and she's a very accomplished needleworker. And I came across a remarkable collection of needlework pieces at an auction house. And we weren't quite sure if we were going to bid on them. But when we came back, my wife loved there were one was done by a girl at a Quaker school, and other ones were just beautiful pieces. And then I began to research them, and they were made by a group of young girls in the 1830s. One was made by their mother, one was made by a cousin. And I tracked them down to a museum, an old courthouse. The girls' family had purchased the courthouse after the court moved to another town. And so I'm actually writing a book right now about the girls and growing up in this courthouse in 1834.
That's amazing. I read a little bit about the research and stuff that you've done so far. I'm looking forward to reading the book now, because this is an amazing sort of story about like how things just kind of, they just have their own life, especially like art and creative endeavor, and how it just lives on for generations. So I'm very much looking forward to reading it when it's available.
We'll let you know. I'm actually staring out. I've got it's not a production copy yet. I'm still going through editing, but I've got one of the first, well, it's Rev 3.1.3. So I use like engineering version numbers.
Yeah.
The same way you do it with software. It's like, okay, 3 is a major rev, and a point, this is a minor rev, and add a new chapter. Okay, so bump up that as a medium rev on each version. So yeah, it's a fun experience. It's for me, I'm always looking for something new to do that I haven't done before, and writing is certainly, I never realized how much work it would be.
Oh yeah. Well, it's it's one of those things where it's you're oftentimes having the research and everything that goes into kind of putting together a narrative, putting together sort of a like an outline for whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. That always for me is the toughest part. It's just figuring out like, what's the framework of this thing? I've got this idea of what I want to accomplish, but how do I actually get there? And so
one of my sort of mentors along the way is Annie Fox, David Fox's wife. So David, who developed, worked on Maniac and developed Zach. His wife writes YA, which is young adult fiction. And I think you interviewed David recently. I think
I did. I've read both of her books. She's working on another one, but I think she said that the first book took like 15 years. The second book took 10 months, and she's gonna like slow down with the third book, so that way that she's got more time to kind of enjoy some of the success from. Because it was like 2024. 2025. It's like enjoy some of the success from these other two books, because like the first book is The Little Things That Kill, afterlife apology tour. We're not paying by the letter, so we're putting a big title on it. And then the second book is Lead a Scimitar Between Two Worlds, I think is I don't have it right in front of me, but they're both excellent. And spoilers, they kind of take place in the same like universe, which I was very appreciative of, and I made sure to let Andy know that.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because the three of us were sitting together at their place a month or two ago.
Oh yeah.
And I was sort of describing, my development effort. And at one point I mentioned, it's like, well, I'm doing this as a fundraiser for the museum where these pieces are now hanging up. And, so I spent some time trying to think about how can I help visitors to the museum and raise money for the museum. And I was just thinking about all these kids that walk in and they're just like, oh my God, my parents took us on a vacation and now they're going to make us walk around another 200-year-old building. And, since we had done all this research on the girls and their background and their history and such, it's like, well, these girls live there and they're the same age as a lot of these visitors. So who would be a better person to welcome somebody into their home and give people sort of a view of what their life was like, in 1834. It's like, these are the girls. And so that's where I started from. But I mentioned how because I'm working with the museum, I have their historians that are going through it and checking it. And I've actually I've been in touch with this is back to the I will call up anybody at any time with no fear. The Maine state historian has asked me if I can send him a copy. And
That's
this
great.
is the guy, yeah, the state has a historian. And it's like, boy, I just hope he doesn't say it's like an abomination, because it's historical fiction. I've got the girls, there's only so much that is known about them. And so everything else, while I put them in a real background and everything else, I'm still trying to tell a story. Now, so this was where it was interesting with Annie, because I have sort of history and historians, and I need to be able to write in a way that the museum itself feels is appropriate. And so, and I don't mind, and I'm very much I've always worked collaboratively, and so I'm getting input from lots of people and former co-workers and friends. And Annie's reaction is just like, I don't know how you can do that. It's like she has her own universes, and she can just write, and anything that she can see, she can write down. And David was awesome, because David kind of jumped in. He said, well, it's kind of like working on Star Wars, because here you've got a universe, but it is, you've got canon, and you can't suddenly have Han Solo act in a way that Han Solo doesn't act. And Jabba the Hutt has to act like Jabba the Hutt. So I just have my own canon. It's called history that
Yeah.
I need to make sure I stay true to history. And it was kind of like an aha moment, both that it kind of gave me another way to look at my book, which I thought was fascinating, is to think about it in the same standpoint that I look at other writing that I've done.
Well, it's I can't wait to read it. I love I love history. I love nonfiction. I like kind of a retelling, especially of kind of early American life. So it'll be exciting to read when you get it, when you get everything ready to publish. But Annie will not forgive me if I don't say the name of her book correctly, which is Lead a Centaur, a life on two worlds.
Yes,
and yes, A Life on Two Planets. Oh my gosh, I messed it up twice. Oh, I'm off the Christmas card list for sure after this. But no, they're both excellent books. And again, I'm very much looking forward to reading your book as well.
Well, if I have any of the success that Annie's had, then I will consider this a success. And I've also written, in the title, it is listed as book 1, and I've included a chapter from the second book. So I think I'm at least committing myself to writing a second book.
Well, it's good to stay on top of that stuff and just keep it going, especially if you take a break, you get the energy, you get back to it. That'll be great. But
there we go.
Speaking of like inspiration and like hard work and just like what's kind of may seem like an insurmountable task, you had joined the management for international development team at LucasArts, and you were in charge of doing a lot of like the localization and working with the programmers that were doing the ports and stuff. Like Aaron Giles, I was lucky enough I got to interview him a couple of months ago. What were some of the pressures with trying to get these games, get them out for multiple platforms, get them out for multiple languages? I think LucasArts did an amazing job, because I mean, there are French games, there's Portuguese games, there's German games, there's French. I mean, it's covered so much ground. What were some of the challenges of that?
It had started out originally that some countries sold better units than we did, even in English. So in Germany, for example, they love the adventure games, and we were approached by, and I may get this wrong, it may have been Soft Gold, and just asked if they could work with us on translation. So I think it was might have been Boris Schneider. I think one of the engineers came by and worked with us. We basically set him up with a development machine so he could do the coding, and and they were responsible for the translations and the production costs. And this was simply text translation initially at the time. It got a lot more complicated when we started doing voice work. But we were doing essentially countries as individual runoffs, and we'd look for usually for a distributor in the country, and then most distributors had their own corral of engineers and artists and things like that, and so we would work with them on the release. We were doing it, in the indie games. There were certainly challenges that we had. For example, I think there may have been some swastikas in Last Crusade and etc. And in Germany, you can't do that. That's a big no-no. So the artists would be going through and redrawing those as iron crosses, or removing the symbology altogether. So that was mostly being run independently by other countries, by developers in other countries, our distributors really more in other countries. And very often it was done maybe a year after the US development. So there's this really big gap. And the downside there was there would be knowledge of the games, but it wasn't based on the same marketing effort. So, it would be, hey, this is a great game from last year. Oh, and now it's in German. So what it really started from, and it's, with the Macintosh sitting right here, was we also, because I built the interpreter for the SCUMM engine for the PC, and then managed it for other machines, the ST, the Amiga, the Mac, Windows, etc. We sort of came up with development processes and how to do it. And you mentioned Aaron Giles. Aaron's an amazing engineer. He sort of showed up on my radar because a floppy disk and a letter from our legal department arrived on my desk. And we had just released, I think it was Rebel Assault for the Macintosh. And the Mac had just come out with their PowerPC, but we didn't have a PowerPC when we were doing development. So our version that we built ran under 68,000, and on the PowerPC it was emulating, which meant the PowerPC code would look at an instruction for the 68,000 and treat it like a token, like that interpreted language, and go, oh, that command says to do this. I'll go jump to this piece of code based on that operational code or an opcode and go execute some code. So it ran significantly slower than even so here's the PowerPC. It's a new processor. It's lickety split. And now it actually runs slower emulating the 68,000, but it did sort of run. What Aaron had done is he did code analysis and said, oh, this part's slow, this part's slow. If I rewrite those in PowerPC, then it runs pretty well. And you still need the Lucas CD that the game came on. So we're not really taking anything from them. We're just giving the user a new executable that's a PowerPC executable. So legal came in and said, should we sue them to stop them? And I said, no, I want to interview them.
Yeah.
And so Aaron came by. He was at the time working for either a university or a medical. He was doing medical work. I forget if it was on equipment or whatever. And he said he had commitments, and he wouldn't be able to join us for about 6 months. And that was a tough. I really wanted to get our Mac stuff going, but I really believed, very impressed by his work. And I said, okay, but I really want you, finish up your work. If you can finish it up earlier, I want you in here. And Aaron came on board, and it was like a cyclone hit. He went through all of our games, learned the system, had technology, had developed technology, certainly, cutting his teeth on the SCUMM games, and really worked through the entire catalog. All the older games that hadn't been moved to the Mac were being moved to the Mac. And then he started tackling the newer games like, Dark Forces and things like that. And the initial reaction was a little hesitant. It's like, who's this guy? And we don't really know him. And he's doing Mac stuff. And we're a bunch of PC guys. And we hold the Mac in low regard to begin with. And okay, and he's asking us for our code. And so, but eventually they would relent, and they'd get Aaron some code, and he'd get it up and running. But in the process of doing it, because the Mac is a different development machine, it's like you never find your last bug until you've been ported to your last machine. And Aaron would find current bugs in their development products and come back to the team and say, hey, I noticed where you wrote the code to do this. There's actually an error in there. I've rewritten it so it doesn't have that error. And the core teams, the PC or Windows teams would go, we've been trying to track that bug down for a week. and you found it. It's because the Mac had different tools that could detect different issues than the Windows machines had. And so pretty quickly, the PC developers realized that they were actually looking forward to when Aaron would come on board, to help bring the games together. Plus, Aaron treated them with such, the games themselves and the developers with such respect. And Aaron is such a, he's fairly soft-spoken and such an amazing engineer that, we pretty much got all the Mac games lined up, over the next year or two after he joined us. Now, the model there was that I developed with cross-platform was we wanted the PC version done within no more than 30 days of the IBM or of the main release. And we actually got it down to less than that. And we even tried a couple titles where we put the PC and the Mac version on the same disk. And the problem was now we had a box that said PC and Mac, and the software stores didn't know which shelf to put it on. So we put it with the PC games, we put it with the Mac games, and as a result, there was some confusion. So after that experiment of basically saying we can do this, we can do simultaneous release, we basically still ran them as separate products, so they ran separate QA processes as well. And so we had this approach towards near simultaneous release. About this time, we had a change in upper management. So over the years at the Lucas companies, I was there for 15 years, we had 7 presidents. And each time a president would come in, I'd sort of, this is what I do, this is what I manage, this is my approach. And, and I sort of felt like for a while I'd sort of manage up and explain to them. And also, sometimes I felt like my job was, with managing my teams was being the shit umbrella where, when stuff came down from management, it was my job to make sure that the team stayed focused. And we got to a point where we had a president and the attitude was, what do we need tools for? We've got enough tools. Don't we already have tools? What do you need new tools for? And it was like, okay, this is a real warning sign. So I stepped back and said, I don't know how that's going to work out, but I better redefine what I'm doing. And I read a whole bunch of white papers from Hewlett Packard and IBM and Apple. And since international had been part of what we did, but it wasn't really well defined and was implemented really as an afterthought, I went and I put a plan together saying, let's treat international the same way we treat domestic product release. So instead of having our distributors doing it, let's bring it in-house the same way we brought our Mac development in-house, and let's work towards simultaneous release. So built a small team, did a lot of database work where, I originally was not a database person. And one of our key people really who came out of our testing organization, she taught me everything about doing databases while I was doing the talkie version of Indiana Jones, because she came into my office one day and it's like, what are you doing? It's like, well, the sound department wants every line that Indy says in a cave because they want to add cave reverb to those lines. It's like, and I'm writing a program to search for cave and Indy and do this. And she kind of looked at that and she says, well, how long have you been doing it? I said, it's probably 30 minutes, 40 minutes. She said, what if I told you could just type in a command and it would do it? I said, you're on, tell me what do I need to do? And so she got me to export every line into a format that could be imported into a database. She loaded it into a database and said, now, every Indy line in a cave, search, poof, and it just showed up. And I said, my world has just changed. And then that technology eventually grew. So it became sort of the model for the technology used by the voice department. So then they had the ability. So then they weren't coming to me making requests. We basically trained them into how to become a database-driven team as well, and that gave us all the control. And then you could write the script. So if you said, okay, we've hired this actor to do this character and this character, you can now print up, and search and do all the lines based on that person, and then you can use the database to track whether they've been edited and things like that. So anyway, so back to the linguistic side. On the international side, I put a proposal together to essentially apply that same concept of simultaneous release of let's do all the languages at the same time, and let's do them alongside the core development project. And one of the benefits was right around that time, the internet was still early, but it was workable enough that we could actually share those databases online and have a database that could be accessed from all those different countries. So we could, when the developers added 20 new lines, we could add 20 new lines and put in a flag there saying these are ready for translation, and then they could translate them. And then the games themselves, we change them. So in that say line, Dr. Fred, whatever it was, at the start of that line, when we did voice products, I put in a marker that told it where to get the voice file from. So we'd already had a notion of a marker in every text line that was sort of invisible, didn't get displayed on the screen, but it was one that could be used. And then that same marker or that ID could also be used where if you have a locale, a language installed, go get that line from the language pack and then display that line as well. And there was also a keyboard combination, because like when I was playing the games, I could hold down a key and I could see the English line. So if it's like, all right, because for me trying to translate in German, you fight like a cow, it's like, oh, I may not be right, but if I held down a key, it's like, oh, I know how to I could insult sword fight behind the scenes to get through that stuff. And then Mary Burr was in marketing, and I went to Mary and I said, how would you like to have the games all done at the same time internationally? And she said, that would be a great idea. If you can do the technology, I'll support you on the marketing side. So we put a proposal together and we're given the go ahead to do that. And it ran like gangbusters. Now, you did ask me at one point about what kind of challenges do you have?
Yeah.
So your background is IT, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll tell you an IT story. We have two projects running simultaneously. And Judith, who is the person who trained me on how to do databases, was doing one of the games, and I was doing the Star Wars Encyclopedia. So episode 1, I think, was coming out, and it was episode 1 or a generic Star. So we had a product with thousands of screenshots and text lines and everything else, and they were both being done on the same server. And that was fine. Server, it's fine. And IT had come in and they said, okay, we're switching you over to a new server. So that's fine. So we moved our projects to the new server, and we've got that going, and it's about 2 or 3 weeks later, and we're on the new server. And I come into the office in the morning, and the IT guy's there at my office door waiting for me. And he says, I have bad news. Oh. He says, the server went down. I said, okay. So when do we have the backups? And he said, I have more bad news. When we put in the new servers, nobody added them to the backup. They haven't been backed up. All we have is your data from 3 weeks ago. He says, but it's not all bad news. So the server had an internal drive and it had an external drive, and one got unplugged while the machine was hot, and it fried the other one. So I forget whether it was the internal or the external drive. One of the two hard drives was basically dead, and it was my project. And this was fortunate because Judith you would have heard the nuclear explosion sound across the country if it had been Judith's project, but hers was the one that survived, so it was just mine. And I only had a backup that was 3 weeks earlier. So, first thing is the guy came to me and he apologized, and it's like, yeah, stuff happens. And I think it was a Thursday, and I said, okay, first thing I want you to do is go get the backup that we had. So it's 3 weeks old, and let's put it, propagate it across my new data, and make sure that you've got this system now being backed up. And sure enough, they did. So at worst case, I've lost 3 weeks.
Right.
Then I went to Vince because Vince was developing the project, and I said, you know what? I burned a disk with the latest version of it. You have a compression tool that puts all the pieces together to make the disk. Can you write the opposite that takes the disk apart and propagates it back into a directory structure? And he said, yeah, that I can do that pretty quickly. So like an hour and a half later, Vince has got a program that takes the latest DVD, propagates it out. So I got the 3-week-old version set up. I've got Vince's system that propagated it all out. I didn't put it over the old one. I went through and I basically I wrote stuff to check it's like, what's the same, what's different, made a list of everything that was different, and then began integrating those pieces in. So I think by Monday afternoon, maybe Tuesday at the latest, so I worked the weekend, and the game was back up. The product was back up and running again. So you have setbacks. It's not so much that you have setbacks. Life is full of setbacks. It's really, your attitude about how you approach it. The other thing I knew from that point going forward was I was going to get the best service from IT, from that point going forward. And actually, to be honest, do you know Jelly Bellies, the little candies?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The Jelly Belly factory is about 30 minutes from here. And I go skiing a lot. And so in the winter, it's like, hey, we'll stop by the Jelly Belly factory at the way home. And we would get what were called belly flops. And these were jelly bellies that like stuck together. You'd have 2 together, 3 together, whatever. But they're all the wild flavors, and they're all thrown into the same bag. And so I get like a bag of Jelly Bellies, like 10 pounds for a couple bucks. And I'd buy a bunch of these, and I'd just keep them in my office. And whenever I had a chance, I'd go down to IT, and they had a bowl there for candy. And I just cut the bag open and pour 10 pounds of, it might have been 5 pounds, 5 or 10 pounds of jelly beans into the IT bowl. And I also knew that was sort of my way of investing in their organization and their happiness, so that when I did need help, I knew that I could turn to them, and I'd get a little bit higher priority in getting, my needs met. So there's your IT story.
You got to grease the wheel, right?
But in a positive way. And nobody could sit there from another team and say, well, it's not fair. You gave them jelly beans. It's like, I gave them jelly beans.
But that's great. It's such an amazing career. So many things changed over the years with Lucasfilm and to the LucasArts, and with the direction of like adventure games, and then kind of leaning very, very hard into the Star Wars franchise for back to kind of arcade style and shooters and things like that. But there was a point where you did leave LucasArts. You've worked with like a ton of other developers. You've done a lot of localization work for other companies, and also with updating older software for modern systems. I'm certainly one of those people that'll say thank you for like the contributions at Nimbus Games with kind of updating the Freddy Fish and Putt-Putt titles and things like that to make those work on newer machines. It's again, to keep this stuff alive and keep it going is a real service to the community, and a big part of the kind of the conservation effort and the keeping all of this stuff around for future generations to enjoy. So thank you so much.
I was at USC, and USC is a big film school. Mm-hmm. Everybody has to take, I don't know what the class was. It was like 120 or 170, something like that. I was having a conversation and somebody mentioned the class number. It's like, oh, you went to USC, you studied some cinema, you took this class. And essentially it's a history of cinema. And one of the first things that you learn is about 90% of the movies that were ever made are just gone. It's like all the old black and white movies, nobody thought to save these. Nobody thought to save the footage. They would sit on shelves, and if you were lucky, maybe somebody's got a movie poster for Fatty Arbuckle in the Sons of the West, cowboy movie or something. But chances are that film, it's the physical film itself, just deteriorated over time or got
Yeah.
too hot and did whatever it did. And so I've always had a place in my heart, both for history itself and also for preservation. And so I just feel incredibly fortunate that, I can go on to any of the forums out there and just sort of watch and see, how much joy some of these games, it's like to people
Yes.
like you're 10,000 hours and all the other people out there and finding a way to preserve them. And so having been with the Lucas companies for as long as I was, I kept all the design documents. And you mentioned the games that we did, and one of the things that's amazing is all the different games and projects we didn't do. We had concepts for Commodore 64 file transfer programs. We had things for people to be able to concepts for people. We had a product, was it telecommuter? Something for somebody who could access their computer at the office and then be able to work at home. So it wasn't just games. We had ideas for all kinds of projects, and of the ones that the concepts came out and that I have documents for, I don't know what, I've never counted, but it may only be 20% got turned into games. Ron, before Maniac had this project, I was a teenage Lobot, and I always get it wrong. So if Ron sees this, he can write me a nasty gram. But it was sort of conceptually based around heavy metal, the
Yeah.
movie. And there's a scene where there's a court scene, and there's somebody being brought in front of a judge, and there's this sphere which is sort of that moves between all the different stories. And this guy is really bad, but he brings a witness on the stand who's supposed to defend him, and instead this witness ends up turning into a monster, and he ends up escaping because of the witness. But that was sort of the universe that I think Ron had wanted to play in, was taking something that was cinematic, well, though in the cartoon universe, and then write a story about it. So it's a story about a guy on a space station who's actually turned into a Lobot. And the concept there was AI doesn't work. Building robots and controlling robots doesn't work. But if you commit a crime, you'll get lobotomized, and then they'll
Oh,
take your
wow.
brain out and they'll stick your brain in the back of this little, into the gray matter container on the back of a robot. And then they'll give you a job to do, like sweeping the floors or shining shoes. And so here's your main character, and he basically wakes up and he's inside a robot body, and he hasn't been lobotomized. And so there's your time pressure, is your body's only going to be around for 48 hours before it gets turned into dog food. So you need to go figure out who did this to you, and then see if there's a way you can get your brain put back in your old body. And then you have benefits because of the shoebot, because you polish shoes. You can get to certain parts on the space station and interact with people, or be ignored by people, or get by security, because nobody would ever think a shoebot, would be a problem inside a secure area. Anyway, so lots of ideas, and maybe in some other universe out there, that game actually did get developed, and that's what would be amazing someday, is to see what that game, or maybe someday Ron will go, hey, that Aric, keeps bringing up that game. Maybe I should go and finally write it. But it was
Absolutely.
in some ways, it was sort of a precursor to SCUMM. It was very dialogue driven, puzzle driven, and the key difference was it was a top down view game, so you had a scrolling section of the screen on a larger map, and that's certainly doable. And what Humongous did with they used the SCUMM system for Moonbase Alpha, so it was a SCUMM game, but it was a top-down view game, much like Red Alert, but done on the moon kind of thing. But you're trying to control space on the moon. And the amazing thing is that the SCUMM system was perfectly happy, writing that type of game as well.
Absolutely. I would love to see those things. I would love to see that stuff come come to fruition. There's so many great ideas out there of things that have just never been made. I'd love to see them all, but we're coming on up on about 2 hours here. I had one big question, the big finale question. I think this is something that you'll definitely be interested in, but my question is this. You are a bluegrass artist. You're a bluegrass fan. I wanted to ask you what your favorite bluegrass song was and why it's Uncle Pin.
So let's talk a little bit about my history. So I mentioned I went to USC. I grew up with 3 older sisters, and my oldest sister played viola. My second oldest sister is a cellist, and actually is still a cellist today. She manages an orchestra and plays cello in a lot of different things. Second oldest sister played violin. Third oldest sister played violin, and so pretty much as when I was a little kid, I was handed a violin as well, so that the family could have a string quartet. I don't think it was my first choice, but I went all the way through high school. Played violin, played in pit orchestras, played in all city orchestras, things like that. So as soon as I got off to college, I went and bought a banjo. And I have to say the influence was probably a lot to do with Steve Martin, and just it looked like fun. Mm-hmm. And and I admired Steve, and actually saw him in one of my classes. He came to one of my cinema classes with what was the movie? Pennies from Heaven, where anyway, so he showed up, and it's like, oh, this is just amazing. So next time I was up in the Bay Area, I went, and it's like, where do you buy a banjo? I had no idea. So I went to a pawn shop. I figured that's where you buy banjos, not knowing that this was like the worst instrument ever conceived. And I didn't like the one that I first saw, but I went to another pawn shop and came back to the first one, and my car had been towed away by the pawn shop owners. And so I went inside and bought the banjo, and then, hey, where's my car? So the money I saved to get my car back basically paid for the banjo. It was a horrible, horrible instrument. But I played that, and then got a new one, and then played. I studied under Jack Tuttle. Now, Jack is one of the most amazing multi-instrument musicians on the West Coast, and his daughter Molly has, I think, twice, it might be twice, she has Grammy Awards for her work. I think most recently she was doing background for Ringo Starr from the Beatles. Mm-hmm. So you say maybe I was incredibly fortunate, to take lessons from Jack. But I played under Jack. I played banjo, then I played mandolin, and then I played violin. And this was because I was at a bluegrass festival, and I'd been playing banjo with friends. And a friend of mine, she wanted to play the bass, and somebody had a bass there, and she played fiddle. And so she borrowed somebody's bass, and I said, "Oh, while you're doing that, can I borrow your fiddle?" So she was just like, how do you play a bass? And I hadn't picked up a violin in 15 or 20 years. And I just started playing. It's just like, I can play by ear. I can play all of our songs, not a problem. And she was just like, what the hell are you doing playing the banjo? I've been trying to play the fiddle for 4 or 5 years. And you just, what did you just do? You pick it up and you just play it like it's nothing. And so I still didn't want to go back to the violin. I still didn't, because of all my childhood experiences and all that trauma. So that's when I switched to the mandolin, because it's tuned the same way. But I didn't have the right hand going, because playing guitar and the mandolin takes a lot of right hand plucking, and I was old enough where your brain is already it's congealed. So learning new things is a bit more difficult. So I did that for a while, and then it's like, okay, I decided, okay, I'll play the fiddle. And there were a bunch of us that were playing under Jack's in one of his classes, and Jack walked in one evening and said, it could be bad news, could be good news. You've all graduated. So we've been playing together and having fun for a while, but Jack wanted to bring in a new flow of musicians, and we've been playing out in front of his class and down the street and playing afterwards on the street. And so for about 9 months of a year, we played as a group, and then five of us decided to form a band. So um, uh, we trying to do both the group and the band was too much. So we sort of let our friends know, it's like, I hope you guys don't mind. We're going to try to form a band. And so we did that for a while, and I think we played together 5 or 6 years. Eventually, I developed ringing in my right ear, and I tried playing the fiddle lower. I tried playing it different ways. I bought an electric fiddle, and it just still became so much of a problem. And I could block that ear, but then if you can't hear the other people you're playing with, it's just not good. And my hearing just kept getting worse. And so I knew a fiddle player and a guitar player, and so they came and joined the band, and I retired from that. Now, you asked me the question, and I'll get back to it. Is my favorite song. One of my favorite bands is a group called the Steel Drivers, and they have a song called "Drinking Dark Whiskey." Telling, I'm drinking dark whiskey, telling white lies. One leads to the other. Anyway, I would say, what I love, if you go through my music collection, because I've got a pretty extensive collection of rock from the 60s through the 80s, when I sort of felt like by the end of the 80s, rock had sort of lost its way. And then I've got a pretty extensive bluegrass library.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at my favorites, it's what I love are I'm going to call them like duet vocalists, where and it's the same with rock songs. When you've got multiple singers working out harmonies, that just got me. That's what I love. And what I love is in bluegrass is, bluegrass is mostly, my girlfriend died, my dog got run over, and if they say she's sleeping, it means she died. If she's under the willow, it means she's died. It is a very sad music form for communities that at the time there was a lot of sad stuff going on, and but I still prefer energetic, high speed, very active duets. Another group is Cherry Holmes. They've got some really good sound in there as well.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, I am a big fan. I am super distantly cousins, roommates, uncles, nephews, taxidermists related to Bill Monroe. So I come from that world. And
that's pretty good genealogy there.
It doesn't stand up on Ancestry.com, but by gosh, at a family reunion, it does. So
there you go. I think I'm related to Lord Baltimore, that Baltimore is named after. Now, it's not the most scenic scene, and I think it was my seventh great grandfather named the town after his grandfather, who was my ninth great grandfather. And I still don't have all the records for that. But like I said, history is a lot of fun.
It absolutely is. And
I just wish I Baltimore. Just any place else, but why Baltimore?
It's like, come on, Palm Springs, just something maybe a little more, a little more Plymouth. But
well, I do actually. We have a relative who was mayor of New York, so there, and then another relative I think was mayor of San Francisco.
Oh my God!
But it was like he came out from the East Coast and wanted to prove himself, and so he figured if he could get himself elected as mayor of something, that people back home would respect him. So fortunate to have pretty serious ties, in both this country's and the state's history here.
That's awesome. Well, if you can get elected there, you can get elected anywhere, right?
There you go.
Yeah. Aric, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. This was a very entertaining conversation. But before we go, show me your boxes real fast. I'll show you the boxes that I have nearby. I have more boxes. They're on the shelf over there. But
all right, well, here's a couple. Okay, actually, what are some of my oldest? Okay, so this actually age-wise, Commodore 64 Koronis Rift. So it's one of my first projects with the Lucas companies. Though this would be, if it's Commodore or Atari. So this is Ron and I worked together on this one. And this is Maniac Mansion. So this is another my project. So this is the PC version. So this was our first internal PC project. We had done, I think on the C64, we did Strike Fleet or PHM Pegasus. And then we hired a guy to bring them over the PC. And I'll tell you a very short, funny story there was on the PC, they were using CGA graphics, which was a 4-color graphics card you could get for your PC. And it could do black, white, cyan, or magenta. Those were the 4 colors it supported. And I just remember walking in and the engineer had a US flag up on the screen, and he was using purple for the star field, and he was using blue magenta for the stripes on the American flag. And I was going, well, why aren't you using blue for the star field and purple for the red stripes on the flag? And he's going, well, it's because it looks right. And I then went, it's like, well, but it's not really the right colors. And then we got into this conversation, and he was adamantly defending why he chose the colors. And then at some point, it came out that he's colorblind. And he's absolutely correct that those are the right contrast for those colors, but they are the completely wrong colors. And a very good guy, but I hadn't known that he was colorblind. But I was just amazed at how adamant he was arguing something with full knowledge that his ability to see colors were different than everybody else's. What else? Oh, okay. So the original, and you notice here, I'll hold it at this angle, shrink wrap.
Yeah,
so
I know. Your retirement copy of Maniac Mansion.
Oh, maybe. I have to tell you, I shared a bunch of pictures of games on my Facebook page, and I was pretty open to, hey, you want to be my friend, and that's fine. And I got a message. It's like, okay, how much for the game?
Yeah.
And I was like, well, these are things I worked on. This is my. I said, yeah, but everything has a price. How much for it? And I was like, I'm really sorry. And I offered him. You know what I had is I had a Zach McCracken. Actually, I had 2 of them, and I don't know where they are right now. Zach McCracken. Before the box is cut, it's a single sheet of paper. So this was straight from the printer before the Zach McCracken box was folded and even cut and made into a box. And I said, I got 2 of these. Would that be, oh, no, that's not good enough. And eventually it was just like, I felt like I lost a fan because of that. And I didn't like that. This is Larry Hollins. This is X-Wing, which I don't think I worked on the original, but there might be something on the tech side. I might have a bit of a credit in that one, but not much. Here's something people may not see very often. This is Vollgas. This is full throttle in German. I think the name translates, Vollgas means full of gas. So Ben is full of gas, and please don't ask me to try to read the German because I'd probably offend somebody. Other interesting stuff. So we did a Christmas tree one year where we took all the international products. So this is Afterlife. So this is Mike Stemley. I think it's Mike Stemley and Sean. Is it Sean Clark? No, this is Michael Stemley. So Mike Stemley. That was his project. Mike Stemley, somebody just pointed out, so I grew up around Stanford. Mike Stemley was in the Stanford band, and my sister was in the Stanford band. So I used to break into the games by disguising myself as a Stanford band member, walking into the stadium with the saxophone, and so I could get into the games for free. In Castellano, so SDS in Espanol for Spanish version of Monkey Island. Yeah. Now you already talked about other challenges linguistically. one of the things that we found in the Monkey Island series is that if you have a gypsy, every country has a different notion of where gypsies come from.
Mm-hmm.
So, like if you're in Spain, you think they come from Italy, or if you're in France, they come from somewhere else. And so, when they wrote the dialogues for gypsies, it was always based on their local concept of that. Curse, I think. One wall we ran into is there's a song in there that we recorded, and I think a lot of the countries just kind of looked at that and just said, "No, we really can't do that." way too much work.
Yeah.
Let's see. This is PC version of Last Crusade.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the graphic adventure, and then I also worked on Last Crusade, the action game.
Mm-hmm.
So the story there was, management had licensed it out to a company in Europe to do the action game across a bunch of different platforms, and we were getting close to the movie release, and they kept sending us discs with IBM versions of it, and none of them worked. So eventually the president came into my office and said, "What can you do to fix this?" And I said, "Well, if you put the engineer on an airplane, I can figure it out." And what it turned out was the engineer was working based on a spec, a printed document of how EGA graphics work. He never had an EGA. Nobody had ever bought him an EGA card. So he was just going based on, this is how it works. And there were a couple of fundamental things that were just really tricky. So he came out, and I think within a day we got it running. Within 2 days, I had some tricks that doubled the performance, so the action game ran twice as fast on EGA. And about a year later, I was best man at his wedding. So there's always a happy tale. Now here's Insider's Guide, but I'm just looking to see if I was looking for the encyclopedia. So I'm not sure if this is the one that I worked on or if this is episode 1. This may be the one that I worked on where the hard drive died. Doing all the work on that. All the classic adventures. So all the original SCUMM games all now in one place.
Yeah.
Got Escape from Monkey Island. Oh, this might be the other one I was thinking about. So this is
Behind
the Magic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not sure I think I did Insider Guide. I don't know if I did Behind the Magic. I have to. That's one of the things that's great about IMDb and Moby Games is I can go back and look at the games that I worked on. Now, what I'm missing here, there's another box in the garage, is all the really classic adventures for automated simulation. So the Epyx games, Star Warrior, Crush, Grumble, and Chomp, Temple of Apshai, Hellfire Warrior, all the expansion packs of Curse of Ra, Dangers at Drendisti, Keys of Acheron, I think. So what was neat at the time is it was a small company, but they were one of the very first companies that did boxes for their games. And they hired real artists. I think George Barr, who also did illustrations for like covers of books. George was the animator who drew the box covers. So super, that's where I was fortunate, was walking into a team with really good people, and a bunch of us still get together. So Robert Leyland, who I worked with there, Diane Asher, Susan Lee Marrow, that were all back at Automated. So this is 40 people I knew 40 years ago. We'll still get together and meet up and swap stories. Or when Lori and I are in DC, we'll have dinner with Susan, and Robert and Diane are just minutes away. We all sort of ended up at the same place. Some of the early developers that I worked with. I'm fortunate, and and mostly what I'll say is I'm fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with the people that I did. So an amazing group of
Absolutely.
talented designers, engineers, writers, artists, animators, you know, people who had ideas of directing things. I've got friends who've been nominated for Oscars for their work, in movies. I've got, I think it was one of the Monkey Islands was part of an exhibit at the Smithsonian Institute a number of years back, and I didn't make it to the exhibit, but I went there about a year later, and they had the book from the exhibit, so I was able to pick that up.
Nice.
The music from our games has been played by orchestras all across the globe, so you can find an orchestra in the middle of Eastern Europe that's playing the music from Monkey Island, and if it's not that, it's somebody who's learned it, who's picked up the guitar and has learned to play it, or somebody's picked up a synth and is playing themes from Curse of Monkey Island. It's funny to say I'm retired because I think I work harder now than sometimes when it seems like when I worked. But that's where I was probably most fortunate, is that I just sort of stumbled in to be amongst some of the most amazing, talented individuals that you could possibly imagine.
Absolutely. So, such an amazing career, such an amazing story. Aric, thank you so much for your time.
Ron, it's really been my pleasure.